A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Montreal seems as unlikely a place for baseball as the Canadian Northwoods for orchids. Queen Elizabeth is on the money, Joan of Arc is in many hearts, and the Hockey Canadiens are worshipped as winners. Perhaps characteristic of the humble beginnings and high hopes of the first big league team outside the U.S. is Coco Laboy, who toiled through 9 minor league seasons before getting a chance this year.
These people here, they crazy about baseball, and they come to see us every day there, even if we lose every day.
Well, are French fans different from, let's say, Puerto Rican fans?
Well, they are a lot different, yeah. In Puerto Rico, you have to have a winning team all the time, but here, they don't care if we're going bad.
Montreal returns his warmth with a bonne chance for his birthday. Dear to the fans is Rusty Staub, who, when a trade seemed to be falling through, refused to return to Houston. He loves the fans for sticking with the club through a 20-game losing streak.
Some people really wanted us to lose 4 or 5 more games to set a world record, you know, or establish the record in the major leagues, because of the fact that it just seemed like the thing to do after losing 20. But we really weren't for that, and we're glad we, discontinued the losing streak at 20 games. But I really can't tell you enough about the way the fans here have made most of the players here feel.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey everybody, how are you? My name is Tim Hanlon. Welcome to the proceedings that we like to call Good Seats Still Available. Yep, it's our curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. God forbid we try to entertain you and keep you distracted yet again this week. We all know what kind of challenges we're all going through. We hope, first of all, that you're all healthy and staying sane, doing all the right things that you should be doing. If you're out there in the wild, acting as a first responder or a critical needs person of either in the healthcare space or in the food services industry, or perhaps you're in the delivery world or the delivering mail, for example, all those other things, frankly, that are, maybe you're on you're a trucker out there and you're kind of delivering goods and stuff. You know, you're in your own ways, you're putting yourselves at risk, and you're doing things that, frankly, are helping everybody else out there. And we, of course, want to tip our, this week, baseball cap, and we'll get into that in a second, to you for all those things that you're doing. And we'll also tip our cap to just all of you who are listening and doing all the right things that you should be doing in your own respective worlds, with your families, your friends, your loved ones, keeping safe, doing all the things that you should be doing and avoiding all the things that you should not be doing. And we wish you all the best in maintaining one's sanity as we all try to figure out this life ahead together. And we're here for you in our own little distracting way. A little frivolity that we forward you to this week, as we do each and every week. It's in the grand scheme of things, obviously very minor, but hopefully something that is at least entertaining for a few moments' time. And this week, we are finally able to get into a story that we've looked for an entree for some time into. And we're going to use this week's episode, our guest this week, Danny Gallagher, to kind of get into our initial foray, and there will be plenty more, I'm sure, into the stories, plural, of the Montreal Expos. And that little clip there that you heard was a beautiful little ditty from a guy in the Wayback Machine from the old CBS News world. His name was Haywood Hale Broun. And if you remember watching CBS evening news broadcasts on the weekends in the late 60s and throughout most of the 1970s, you'll know that Haywood Hale Broun was sort of the poet laureate, I guess, of sports, and was quite the feature writer and producer and storyteller. And that clip was from, I don't know what date that was from the CBS Evening News, but it was reconstituted from a show that ESPN Classic did, basically comprised of all of many of Haywood Hale Bruin's reporting. It was called Woody's World. We grabbed that clip, and that was, of course, Mr. Bruin talking about, in this case, 1969, which was the debut a few months in to that of the Montreal Expos, their first ever season in Major League Baseball. And we get into that topic, the beginning and the middle and a bit of the sad end, or the maybe not so sad end of the Montreal Expos. And we also get into the once again possibly of this story, because as you probably well know, if you follow baseball over the last number of years, Montreal has certainly somehow remembered that it had a baseball team. And for many years, as we get into our conversation with Danny in a few moments, it wasn't necessarily for a lot of those years, although there were some exceptions, sort of warmly and robustly embracing these Expos, especially in the waning years, the 90s and the early aughts. And it was a messy divorce, them leaving Montreal and splitting some seasons in Puerto Rico, of all places, and the sort of ham-handed way that they wound up going to Washington to become the Nationals. And we get into a whole bunch of that stuff. But the story of how Montreal actually has quite a bit of baseball history prior to 69. They were angling to get a pro team at the highest level in major leagues as early as, the beginning of the decade of the 60s. Jackie Robinson, of course, famously played some minor league ball with the Royals up in Montreal. But as we get into our conversation with Danny Gallagher, he, the writer of count 'em, 6 books of Montreal Expos history, including his latest work, Always Remembered, New Revelations and Old Tales About Those Fabulous Expos. And we get into some of those as well. It's a great and fascinating story, and it's been, a whole bunch of years now since Montreal has had that baseball sort of frenzy. And as we get into our conversation, you'll hear that Warren Cromartie in particular, pretty instrumental in sort of helping stoke the fire anew of nostalgia around the Expos and exhibition games, and Toronto Blue Jays coming to play some games and all that kind of stuff. And look, they're in the mix all of a sudden. The idea of possibly sharing a season or two or more, maybe longer term, with the Tampa Bay Rays as they kind of perhaps struggle through their stadium situation and arguably maybe not long for remaining in that market. Montreal is somehow risen in stature for potentially relocation of a team, and there are certainly a handful of teams that could qualify, Tampa being one of them, perhaps Miami being another. I doubt, frankly, expansion is really sort of in the cards, especially now. But make no mistake, if baseball is to look afield from its current ports of call, I think Montreal is somehow almost oddly and uniquely found itself back into the mix. And we're going to get into a little bit of the original Expos. It's certainly not comprehensive, and there's so many stories to get into. But we do touch on some of the great stars, some of the hijinks. We even get into Youppi, the enigmatic mascot that is now even more strangely no longer a part of the Expos and or Nationals lineage, but now is part of the Montreal Canadiens. So he's a mascot for them now. So there's a whole bunch of interesting and fun-filled stories and anecdotes that we get into with our guest this week, Danny Gallagher, as we talk about the Montreal Expos, the first of, I'm sure, many conversations that we'll have about this very curious and interesting and occasionally decent and high-quality team, but they never really got over the hump there to sort of get into sort of playoff glory. We get into all of that and more in just a couple of seconds. And before we do so, we want to, of course, tip our Montreal red, white, and blue cap in the general direction of one of our great sponsors this week. And, of course, this week it's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Our pal Dean Mitchell in San Diego way, in the beautiful area of deep Southern California. Dean and his pals have continued to curate a lovely collection of great sports memorabilia. If you're looking for media guides or programs or ticket stubs and magazines or even jerseys or pennants and all kinds of memorabilia from just about every professional and even collegiate sports, frankly, even international sports competitions that you're looking for, whether it's football or baseball, certainly soccer, how about basketball or hockey, even the Olympics or tennis, stadiums, racing, you name it. All of those things well curated, well lit, and beautifully photographed at sportshistorycollectibles.com. This ain't no general dimly lit free-for-all like an eBay. No. This is stuff that's high quality, and it's got some stories and history behind it, and you get lots of great imagery to sort of really get a sense of what you're looking for. And yes, very reasonably priced, and new stuff just about every week. And it's all there for you to check out at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And of course, when you're checking out, we wouldn't leave you hanging. No, of course not. We got a promo code for you, and we're going to that's going to score you 15% off all of your purchases. And that promo code is Good Seats. Make sure you use the promo code Good Seats when you go to sportshistorycollectibles.com. Make lots of purchases, why don't you? And save 15% off all of them. And we thank Dean, and we thank our your sponsorship of this silly little show for, God, almost 3+ years now. And we can't thank you enough, Dean, and sportshistorycollectibles.com. All right, we can't thank you enough for listening, not only through all of that great promotional messaging and checking out our great sponsors and sites, but of course, for continuing to listen as we get into our first at-bat, as they might say, as we get into the story, the beginnings of the story of the Montreal Expos. Here it is. Please enjoy. Maybe you can sort of give our audience a bit of a sense of what is your relation to this team? How has it become sort of a semi-passion of yours? Because you've written a whole number of books on this team. There must have been some sort of overlying or underlying reason as to why this has been such a big topic in your life. Maybe a little background there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, in 1969, the Expos came into the National League as a franchise, and that's when I started cheering for the Expos in my hometown near Ottawa, Ontario, which is maybe 2 hours west of Montreal. Grew up in a small town called Douglas, Ontario, near Ottawa, and obviously got connected with the Expos by cheering for them. And our local team, adult team in Douglas, we decided to call our team the Douglas Expos. So, and then over the course of the next few years, number of years, I would go to a number of games at Jarry Park and then later Olympic Stadium, to watch the Expos play, either with family members in a car or maybe on a bus. So that's how I got really acquainted with the Expos. And then, of course, in 1988, I became a Expos beat writer for the Montreal Daily News, which is no longer in business, but I continued to cover the Expos for a number of years in Montreal as a beat writer for other media outlets. So I do have a pretty good connection with the Expos. And then, of course, since then, written, hundreds of articles about the Expos and the possible return of baseball to Montreal. And I've written 6 books about the Expos, so pretty tuned into the Expos.
Well, yeah. Oh, so I guess the question then generally is why? What is it or was it about this team? I get a little bit of a sense that, some of your pre-career, pre-journalism work or life, frankly, was as a fan, I guess, as all people in sort of the region might have been, it being at the first Major League Baseball team in Canada, right?
Exactly. So 1969, the Expos beat the Blue Jays by, a number of years. The Blue Jays came in 1977. So the Montreal was the first Major League team in Canada. And, one of my favorite experiences, you talked about the pre-journalism days. I was actually a reporter at the time, but I wasn't covering the Expos. I was in Ottawa covering working for a newspaper called the Ottawa Journal, a daily newspaper, and one of the big highlights of going to see those Expos play was the occasion in late July of 1979 when Rusty Staub returned to the Expos from the Detroit Tigers in a trade after he had been away from the team for a number of years. He was the early franchise hero from 69 to 71, and then he was traded away. But then, in 1979, he made that appearance back home for the first time in the trade. So there was a doubleheader, and so the first game he didn't play. He had to sit on the bench. But in the second game, he came in as a pinch hitter, and wouldn't you know, there was 59,000 people in the stands. It was just electrifying at Olympic Stadium. Just the place was just rocking. And he came he was introduced as a pinch hitter, and the place just went nuts. So he tried to step into the batter's box, and he just couldn't because the crowd was so loud, and he had to back out 2 or 3 times to let the fans cheer for him. So that's one of my, maybe the favorite moment in Expos history for me.
Well, look, and I guess that's also because he was one of the original members of the team when they started in '69. Now, I grew up in the New York area, right? So I know of Rusty Staub mostly as a New York Met, right? Obviously near the sort of in the twilight of his career, and still, arguably well loved and revered as a Met for sure then. But it's probably even a pales in comparison to, I guess, how reverential that he was, I guess, from being just well known as a standout in the early days, and then frankly coming back home again, so to speak, in the middle of his career in '79 that you're talking about.
Exactly. Like he was called Le Grand Orange because of his red hair, and he was popular in the city, popular with his teammates. He was just and across Canada, he was a great, well-loved figure across Canada as well. So he had a lot going for him, and when he was traded to, the Mets for Ken Singleton, Mike Jorgensen, and Tim Foley, a lot of people were unhappy about it, and, for 8 years he played elsewhere. So when he came back, it was quite a homecoming for that particular game. He never did get to play too much the rest of the '79 season, but people still think of it as a pretty good moment that he came back and was so well loved.
Well, maybe we should dial back a little bit because, you're talking about '79 and some, and we get into the '80s too, which was certainly a lot of notable sort of ups, if you will, in the Expos history. But, going back, I mean, the whole idea of a franchise in Montreal specifically, or Canada generally, right, was quite novel, although, I think baseball's history in Montreal was fairly substantial in the minor leagues, right? Jackie Robinson playing with the Royals prior. But I guess the whole notion of a baseball team in Montreal wasn't a success from the start for sure, and it wasn't guaranteed to even happen given all the fits and starts. I mean, this idea even of Jarry Park, right, was arguably temporary at best in the early days. But I don't know, I guess, how conscious were you, shall we say, if were you of the team when they came aboard in '69, and how much of a big deal was it at the time? Was it open arms or suspicious or what in '69?
It was, you make a really good point, Tim. In 1962, Jerry Snyder, who was a Montreal city councilor appointed by the mayor, John Drapeau, to pursue the possibility of getting a Major League team in Montreal, he started going to Major League Baseball meetings, as they say, in 1962, to beat the drums about the Montreal being a good location to have a franchise. And, it went on for a number of years, but Jerry Snyder just kept plugging away, and he finally convinced the Major League owners to give Montreal a franchise in 1968. And you talked about Jackie Robinson and his connection with the Montreal Royals. Well, the Dodgers owner decided that Walter O'Malley, he knew that connection between Montreal and baseball, and he helped side with Jerry Snyder at the Major League Baseball owners table, and it was approved that Montreal would get a team. And you talk about the fact that in the early days of Montreal getting the franchise, it was all kind of in doubt. That is correct, because the ownership group was kind of in jeopardy. Some people didn't want to come on board. And finally, Charles Bronfman, who eventually became the majority owner, moved in and said, I'm not letting this team go to Buffalo or wherever it is that was rumored to take over Montreal if they couldn't come up with the money to keep the team in Montreal. That would be, in 1968. And then in August of 1968 is when it was officially announced that Montreal would have the team, even though it was months earlier. But all of this work had to be done by Bronfman to get the money on board to keep the team in Montreal. And you also mentioned, Tim, Jarry Park finally became an option after a number of other places just didn't fit the bill for Major League Baseball people. And so, yes, before they even played a game, the Expos did have some issues that finally had to be resolved.
Well, I guess a couple of things there. So number one, I mean, sort of the stadium landscape there in Montreal at the time. I mean, this is obviously before the 1976 Olympics and even a glint in anybody's eye about a modern stadium as part of that, right? But you also had, I guess, this autostade thing, which I know the Montreal Olympique in the North American Soccer League played in a very, for lack of a better term, curious construction. And that sort of didn't even fit the bill. So I guess this Jarry Park thing was almost temporary by nature, and I guess assumed to only be a short-term solution, and I guess to sort of keep people comfortable with the fact that Montreal was going to get a team. I guess my real question is, it took a lot longer, didn't it, for a more modern stadium, that in the shape of Olympic Stadium, to become the home? But it seems that the 70s were kind of just dominated by uncertainty, I guess, maybe about where they're going to be domiciled. Was Olympic Stadium going to be even in the realm of consciousness? And it seems a bit strange as a way to get going and ingratiate yourself with the local populace with such shaky, I guess, understanding of maybe where the team is going to play, for God's sakes.
Exactly. Like you mentioned the Autostade, and then in the old Royal Stadium called Delomier Downs. Well, Delomier Downs was considered like too small. The Autostade was kind of like, for soccer and other things. The football team played a little bit at the Autostade. And finally, a couple of people in the media, including Expos announcer, a future Expos announcer, Russ Taylor, who was a local Montreal broadcaster, he came up with the idea of telling Chub Feeney and the Commissioner Bowie Kuhn at the time about this possibility of this little ballpark at Jarry Park. And so they all went over there one time in 1968, and that seemed to convince Bowie Kuhn and Chub Feeney that this ballpark was efficient enough to allow Montreal to take the team, because it was in kind of jeopardy, as you say, And finally, it was, Jarry Park was accepted and fixed up, and no more than maybe, I think, 29 or 30,000 seats. But, even then, Jarry Park, it was a quaint, cute little cozy ballpark. But I think Montreal wanted something more, like something better, long before 1976 or 1977 when they finally moved in. But all those years they played at Jarry Park, and it was the fans kind of fell in love with the place.
Oh, kind of cozy, I would imagine. But it also, I guess there are a couple of things conspiring there. I mean, one is, the team was certainly not doing all that well in the early years, which frankly most expansion teams didn't and kind of still don't. I mean, although the economics are a little different now. But I also get the sense too that, and this is now vague recollection, but Olympic Stadium, right, which was obviously the sort of the crown jewel, I guess, of facilities with respect to the now looming 1976 Summer Olympic Games. It's my understanding that it was, I guess, to put it charitably, delayed. And my thought is that I guess the Expos were expecting perhaps to have perhaps access to that even before the Olympic Games, and that sort of fell through. Why did it take until, I guess, 77 years, I guess, 5, 6, 7 years later than I think people thought that Jarry Park was going to be used for them to finally get into this brand new stadium and maybe, get on with it?
Yeah, it was crazy because of the construction delays. Millions and millions of dollars are way over budget, Tim, and they spent a fortune on construction and truck drivers who were, putting in bills that for dumps of gravel that they never made. It was like a catastrophe of overspending, and it's right. They wanted to move in before 1976, but a lot of construction delays, and it was really too bad because it would have been a big difference to Jarry Park. Even though Charles Brockman, he never did like Olympic Stadium because it was too expansive and too big and just too much concrete, and he always thought it was never a baseball stadium.
Well, yeah, and I've been there a couple of times, and obviously it's still there, and it houses the Montreal Impact for a few games every year, Major League Soccer, et cetera, and still, is a fascinating structure to me for a lot of different reasons. But I guess it was sort of almost a dichotomy in that it was sort of viewed as a white elephant even going into the Olympics because of all those construction delays and overspending and all of that stuff. But then it also felt, like it was a shot in the arm given the decline in the attendance in those mid 70s at Jarry Park. It was a shot in the arm, I guess, in terms of getting people to relook at the team and, being in a brand new, if you will, modern facility. But it really did, I guess, become perceived as almost like as a white elephant generally, and maybe almost it was certainly not the most cozy and inviting, I guess, of environments to play baseball across Major League Baseball, right?
Yeah, in 1979 to 82, and maybe even 1983, actually, you could say that was a blessing to have a big stadium like that, because a lot of times when they had that little dynasty from 79 to 83, that place was electrifying. We'd get crowds in the 50,000s, 50 to 60,000 a game a lot of times, and it was quite the place to be. That was the golden era of baseball in Montreal in that particular time in the late 70s and early 80s. So it was a blessing to have a stadium like that.
Okay, so how much of that then was sort of being in a modern stadium with more conveniences and all that kind of stuff, and how much of it was the fact that you had, and obviously as we see over time, just standout / all-star / Hall of Famer type players in people like, Gary Carter and Steve Rogers and Tim Raines, Andre Dawson and Tony Perez. I mean, you had Dick Williams as the manager. I mean, that was, how much of it was the fact that they were finally competitive and full of quality play versus that of the stadium itself, or were they just kind of partnered, I guess, in instilling excitement for this team?
Yeah, it's interesting that when they moved into Olympic Stadium from Jarry Park in 1977, that's when that core of players that you just mentioned started to gel. They may have been there a year or two, or Dawson, who started in 1977, the first year at Olympic Stadium. That core of players started to gel and become the nucleus of a team that finally gelled in 1979 when they almost made the playoffs, winning 95 games and going over 500 for the first time since they had started in 1969. From 69 to 78, they had never finished at 500 or above. And finally, in 79, they won 95 games, and wouldn't you know it, they never made the playoffs because the Pirates beat them out. And then, 1980, they got beat out again. They won over 90 games again, and the Phillies beat them out. And at the last game, when Mike Smith hit the home run off of Stan Bonson, and then, in 81, the Expos finally win a playoff berth in the strike-shortened season and play 10 playoff games, beating the Phillies in a 5-game series, and then losing to the Dodgers in 5 games on the Blue Monday game. And then 82 was another great team, but they suffered badly in the latter half of the season and just kind of faded. But Tim, they had some pretty good nucleus of teams there from 79 to 82. 83 wasn't quite as good, but
no, and this is also you young whippersnappers out there, right? This is also before the thing called the wild card teams and all that kind of stuff, which arguably, and it took a long time. And this is a great example, frankly, about maybe why, I don't know why it took so long in baseball. Obviously, a lot of tradition and all that, but you wonder if more than just the division winners in baseball at that time, i.e., adding a wild card team or two, as we currently have today, might have been an interesting, different sort of history for Montreal, given the fact that they were so close but no cigar in those years in particular. But I want to go back to 1981 because you even read a specific book about Blue Monday, which you referenced. I want to sort of maybe circle around that in the 1981 season, unique as it was overall in baseball, and maybe specifically unique and maybe ultimately frustrating for a lot of different reasons for the Spos. Maybe you can give our audience a little bit of a sense of, I mean, you've already described sort of this sort of mini dynasty, or at least this mini phenomenon of the Expos during these years. Attendance too, by the way. I think they were one of the top 3 or 4 teams in Major League Baseball, frankly, with attendance, right, which is completely uncharted territory for the team at the time. But they were winning, doing very strongly and coming just close, maybe unfairly so, into making the playoffs. But 81, they finally did, but under the weirdest of circumstances. And frankly, it didn't end all that well, and that was a strange story in and of itself, too.
Exactly. See, the players went on strike in the early part of the 1981 season, and they were away for several months, and then they finally settled with the management that they would go back playing. And then, so the last couple of seasons, or last couple of months, it turned out that there was some weird playoff formats that were settled, where the first half winner would play the second half winner in the division playoffs in both leagues. And the Expos won the second half, so they ended up playing the Phillies, who had won the first half. It was funny, like the Phillies already knew, when the strike was settled, the Phillies already knew that they were going to be in the playoffs. But the Expos had to really fight hard to, win the second half and finally end up playing the Phillies in the National League Division Series and best of 5. And what was really upsetting to the Cincinnati Reds and the St. Louis Cardinals is that overall they had better records at the end of the year than the Phillies and the Expos, but they never made the playoffs. So they were pretty upset about that. But anyway, that's how the Expos get in. They had a good second half, helped out by the division, the playoff clinching game in New York when Wallace Johnson hit the 2-run triple, one of, I guess, the biggest triple in Expos history, to get the Expos into the postseason against the Phillies.
Well, they also changed managers though, right after the strike shortened resumption of the season, right? So that probably didn't sort of help, or maybe it did help matters, right? Because Montreal kind of sort of caught fire near the end there.
That's right. On September the 6th, John McHale, the general manager, called up Jim Fanning, who was working out of the Expos offices in Montreal, in the scouting department and the player development department, and asked him, look, would you be interested in becoming the manager of the Expos if I make a change with Dick Williams? So Jim Fanning said yes, and then the next day, Dick Williams was still the manager on September the 7th, and then John McHale called Jim Fanning up again. Look at Jim, I'm making a change. I'm replacing Dick Williams, and I want you to take over as manager. I want you to come down to Philadelphia on September the 8th, and that's how it turned out. It was pretty weird. Like, Dick Williams was a hard-nosed disciplinarian, kind of like, really smiled. Some of the players didn't really like him, but they respected him. He was a winner with Oakland and the Red Sox, and he was a former AAA manager with the Red Sox team in Toronto, won a couple of AAA championships with Toronto, and he was a winner. And so he had spent, 4.5 years with the Expos. So it was a shock that he was fired by the Expos, but John McHale thought that a mild-mannered guy like Jim Fanning would be best suited heading into the final weeks of the season to try to get a playoff berth, and it worked out that way. But guys like Warren Cromartie, they protested against the move to fire Dick Williams, but it worked out, and the Expos finally get into the postseason, even though Jim Fanning was never really considered a good manager. But some decisions he made just didn't work out. But he's always credited as being the manager who got the Expos into the postseason for the first time. Yeah, that's true, I guess, but it also seems counterintuitive, right? Because, Williams was the guy who was really kind of leading sort of the last couple of years of success. I mean, again, 90 wins, 95 wins. But Montreal also squeaked into the postseason by a mere half game, right, of the Pirates over the Pirates to get in there. But all right, so set the scene for the National League Division Series, because the Dodgers were the opponent, and the way it ended, obviously, was sort of a deep mark and lasting mark in Expos history. What was it about sort of this series and this Blue Monday you refer to? What was that, and why is it so, I don't know, indelible, I guess, for better or for worse, in Montreal Expos history? Yeah, you know what? That series started out pretty good for the Expos. Even though they lost the first game in Los Angeles, they came back and won the second game in Los Angeles when Ray Burroughs pitched a 2-0 shutout and beat out the phenom Fernando Valenzuela to tie the series. And then the third game, the rest of the series was going to be played in Montreal. So in Game 3, Jerry White, the fourth outfielder, playing full time pretty much in that series, he hits a 3-run homer, and the Expos win that game 4-1. Steve Rogers wins the game, and they're in the driver's seat in a best-of-5 series. So they should have been really pumped up for the next game, but they really weren't. And they lost that game, the fourth game, 7-1, and the Dodgers tied the series 2-2 with the fifth and deciding game coming up, and then the first scheduled Game 5 was rained out or snowed out because of bad weather, and then it was played on a Monday, and that's why it's called Blue Monday. Played on a Monday, and Rick Monday of the Dodgers hit the famous home run in the top of the ninth inning to give the Dodgers a 2-1 lead, which they kept, even though the Expos came up in the bottom of the ninth inning and got a couple of men on base. But that is one of the turning points in Expos history. Blue Monday for sure. It's a bad memory for Expos fans, and even Tim, there's a few Expos fans won't buy my book Blue Monday because it's too depressing.
Well, but it's obviously part of the lore, and look, it was the closest taste, frankly, that the team had into the postseason. I mean, the irony is, well, there's irony, but I mean, it's you wonder that this is a team. I guess we sort of look more longitudinally now. I mean, with an amazing array of quality players and all-stars at that. I mean, Pete Rose made an appearance a little later in the years ahead, and I mean all kinds of good reputation for developing talent. But never really kind of approached that sort of level of success, despite sort of flashes of brilliance and promise and possibility along the way. I guess I struggle to figure out, and again, this is through the lens of growing up in the New York metro area and obviously baseball in New York and, having sort of that sort of worldview, for better or for worse. What was it about this team that they weren't jinxed, I guess, but they certainly were. They had their moments with Montreal, the Montreal populace. There was certainly a love there, perhaps maybe in retrospect as the team sort of ultimately wound up leaving. But describe to me sort of, I guess, what baseball in the 80s and onward in Montreal was like, because it seemed like there was, for every glimmer of hope, there was, a couple of steps backward in moribundness or folly in the stadium. It was outdoors and cold, and then the dome, and it just didn't seem like Youpie. We got to get into that. I mean, it just seems like it was an interesting and maybe not necessarily a hugely successful, or maybe I'm missing it, and maybe there was something there that I just didn't get, being sort of the naive American below the border.
Well, very good point, Tim. After that stretch from 79 to 83, when they had some pretty good teams, you mentioned it, there was that lull, a stretch of time when the Expos were kind of not into it that great on the ball field from 84, 85, 86. They got new managers after, Jim Fanning did some in 82 and 84, and then 83 and 84 were Bill Verdon was the disciplinarian who tried to come in, and it just didn't work out with him. And then they brought in a new manager, Buck Rogers, who was good with the media and very good with pitchers and talent. And but in 87, they had a great year. They won 91 games, and I call them a Cinderella team that almost won the NL East, but they lost out near the end of the season. And they weren't expected to do much because they'd lost Andre Dawson to the Cubs through free agency, and they traded Jeff Reardon, their big reliever, after the 86 season to the Twins for a few guys who were not really that great, well known. And then 88 they were so-so, and then they had another great team in 89, Tim, when they should have won the NL East. They led the NL East for most of the year, and then the bats faded in August and September. and it ended up so bad that they traded for Mike Leinson from the Mariners in exchange for Randy Johnson and Brian Holman and Gene Harris. Randy Johnson ended up as a Hall of Famer, but Brofman wanted Dave Dombrowski, the general manager, to go for the jugular and let's try to win this pennant this year, and it didn't work out. And at the end, Charles Brofman, that's when he decided he was going to sell the team.
Yeah, so it may explain maybe that sale, because obviously a change in ownership, is generally looked upon as being okay now, something different, new blood, new approaches and stuff. Why did Bronfman sort of just give up on it and look towards new ownership? Because it didn't seem like new ownership really made all that difference. Because frankly, as the 90s wore on, some of the research I've seen, it almost felt like that the Expos were kind of struggling to sort of be, were serious enough to be given attention in the sports scene. It almost seemed like they were sort of fading out of the Montreal sort of sports scene and maybe social scene at that.
That exactly. You're hitting some pretty good points there, Tim. Charles Bronfman has told me several times over the last few years, including just recently for my book called Always Remembered, that he thought of the attendance fading in the last number of years in the 80s, and the thing that kind of really hit home was the collapse in 1989. But he told me his disinterest in owning the team was fading because of the so-called, lackluster attendance for some pretty good teams that were coming into Olympic Stadium. Some great talent, some great players who came up through the great farm system of the Expos, and he got discouraged and disenchanted and disappointed. But that 89 collapse was the thing that kind of just said, I'm giving it up. So after 20 years, he wanted to sell out.
Well, there's also this recurring sort of snake bit kind of thing too. I mean, obviously I want to get into Felipe and Moises Alou, because obviously those are big names, especially Felipe being the manager for such an extended period of time. But, I look at, for example, the curse of the 1994 season, right? Another player's strike, right? And again, almost fate intervening, and not sort of in this case positively. I mean, I think a lot of people forget just how hot the Expos were in 94, right? I mean, talk about the opportunity to finally get over that hump. I mean, they were, if I had it correct, I think they were on pace for something like a crazy, like 105 or 106 game sort of winning season. Now, I don't know if they've gotten there, but I think when the strike sort of occurred, I think they were something like 74-40 or something like that. And
that's right. And
then boom, right? And then may I explain that, because in some respects, I look at almost like the 94 season. And we were talking about the Blue Monday in 81, but you almost look at 94 as being almost sort of the quintessential, microcosm of the futility of the Expos, at least on the field experience.
Well, that's right. See, in 92, after the Expos fumbled and bumbled around with the new manager, Tom Reynolds, who was another one of those disciplinarian types who were just loathed by the players. Dan Duquette, the general manager at the time, made a great decision to bring in Felipe Alou, who probably should have been a manager in the major leagues long before that. But in May of 92, Felipe came along, and the rest of the year they really improved in the standings. And then 93 was a tremendous year as well, almost as good as 94. They won over 90 games in 1993, and that set the basis for another great team in 94. And, that was a really young team, talented and a lot of speed and great pitching and great offense. And, Jeff Fassel and Randy Milligan were probably the only guys over 30. And they had a great nucleus that should have been there for years. And then it all fell apart when the players went on strike on August the 12th. And the even worse feeling was on September the 14th when but still decided to announce the cancellation of the season. So that really was a heartbreaking event for Montreal ownership and fans.
Well, it also seems too that it was sort of the exclamation point, I guess, around, and I know Bronfman was beside himself, I guess, is seeing the money being spent in Major League Baseball and trying to be competitive and getting sort of caught up in having to sort of, and arguably I think Montreal is sort of punching above its weight given its formidable farm system and commitment to youth and players and development and all that, right? That's sort of arguably the quote unquote right way, right? Versus, in the 90s, of course, you got a bunch of expansion and, a lot of new money and people kind of wanted to win sooner rather than later. And, there's a point at which I think that catches up with certain owners, especially those, who've been either in or directly owning franchises for some time, right? Where they kind of have to make a decision whether they're going to, compete and spend that money and deficit spend and do all those things. But I guess it also sort of brought into relief, and this seems like it was sort of the defining narrative as the 90s were on. I mean, 95 obviously was just a collapse of a team. They were selling players, right? And it was pretty clear that a lot of people were disenchanted either all of a sudden or accumulated over time with the facility known as Olympic Stadium, right? That it was not sort of the modern sort of many revenue stream kind of park that was becoming more desired and frankly necessary in order to be competitive to keep up with all the high price talent.
Yeah, you know what? That's a good point. See, the unfortunate thing of having a consortium of owners that took over from Charles Bronfman is that they were constricted or restricted because they had very little money. Claude Brochu, the managing general partner, really had no money like, let's say, a Steinbrenner or whoever who had lots of money as a majority shareholder in a team. It was Brochu with very little money himself running a consortium of owners who put in, $5 million to $7 million more as a gesture, Canadian gesture to keep the team in Montreal, but they basically had no money. And in April of 1995, when the strike was finally settled, Brochu made the decision to tell General Manager Kevin Malone to trade John Wetland, Ken Hill, Marquise Grissom, and there was no offer to free agent Larry Walker. So the basis of that 94 team was gone, basically because there was no money to really keep them around. Although Kevin Malone tried to twist Brochu's arm and try to say, look, give it another few months of 95 to see if this team will be competitive. But Brochu decided late at spring training to have these guys traded.
Well,
but if Bronfman was still there, he probably would have kept those players because he had all kinds of money, and basically baseball was just a hobby for him because he made all his money through liquor and so on.
Well, I mean, aside from some of these bright spots on the field, Vladimir Guerrero, for example, I mean, there's very interesting little pieces of hope and positivity. It feels to me, again, through the hindsight of history, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like the bulk of the latter part of the 90s and obviously the early part of the 2000s was kind of almost sort of this deck chair rearrangement around how to re-inject interest in this franchise. Obviously, the idea of a new stadium to keep this franchise in Montreal, and maybe at certain points over time, whether it be money or politics or just simple fan interest, that at some point that it was kind of almost, in motion, that it was not for long by the turn of the decade to keep this franchise in Montreal.
Exactly. Like the majority general partner, Claude Brochu, in the late 90s, they mounted an effort to to get a new stadium, site projected, and they did have it, downtown Montreal, and when Brochu left the ownership group and was replaced by Jeffrey Loria also promoted this idea of getting a new stadium, but unfortunately, both Brochu and Loria were never able to get that concept of a stadium to fruition, and the commissioner at the time, Bud Selig, tried to help Brochu out to approach the Quebec Premier Lucien Bouchard to try to put up funding for a new stadium, but Bouchard would say, we're closing hospitals in Montreal, how can we fund a new stadium? So that concept of a new stadium, which would have really probably saved the franchise, it never came to fruition. And then in 2002, that's when Bud Selig engineered this, what he calls a triple play, to change the ownership group in Montreal and Boston and Florida. So Loria sold his team to Major League Baseball, and Selig and the owners allowed John Henry to sell out the Marlins and buy his dream franchise, the Red Sox, and then Loria bought the Marlins. So it's, Tim, from 2002, 2003, and 2004, a lot of Montreal fans just basically kind of gave up on the franchise because they were upset with Major League Baseball for taking over the team and not really caring about wanting to try to keep the franchise there.
Yeah, and look, obviously, Montreal's a huge hockey town, and that's obviously probably first, second, and third level of interest, and that sort of, that sort of weighs heavily too. But I also think, in many respects, I think you have local government there, and recognizing perhaps a little bit earlier than the reality check that finally is hitting a lot of metropolitan areas now and local municipalities that, what do we spend money on, right? A tax supported stadia and all that kind of stuff. I mean, in some respects, it's almost a prescient understanding that, there are various needs that municipalities have, and maybe, building a stadium that is largely for the benefit of a for-profit enterprise that's owned by a small group of people may not sort of be it. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, but it feels to me that even before 2002, that there was almost sort of this feeling in the air that, that the Expos were not just going to, they weren't much longer for the city of Montreal. I guess what I'm really curious, and I don't want to get back to some happier memories as we kind of maybe looked around the corner here. Maybe you can explain what it was like during those years, because there was just sort of this odd and strangely now new again concept of having a team and having it spend a good portion of its season, 20, 30 games elsewhere. And in this case, Puerto Rico of all places. I mean, it must have been a real challenge to be a fan of the Montreal Expos during those years.
Oh, for sure. Bud Selig, he told me for my book, Always Remembered, and he's told reporters this before, that because of the lack of interest and poor attendance in Montreal in the late 90s and the early 2000s, that this was a concept, a pretty weird concept. They wanted to try some games in Puerto Rico as an option to create revenue to try and keep the team in Montreal. But it was a pretty weird concept. But it's true. See, most of the time in the existence of the Expos franchise, they never had very good season ticket figures, Tim, except for probably that period between 79 and 83 when it was just rocking. That was the golden age of baseball. Even in 94 and 93, they they didn't really have great season ticket figures. In '94, they had a lot of great walk-up crowds when they were buzzing in '94, and they were almost unbeatable. But they would have people just walking off the street and buy tickets the day of the game. But there weren't many season ticket holders, and in pursuing years, there were never very many season ticket holders. I can't give you any figures, but it was very low. So Major League Baseball could see that. Montreal people could see that, but
and the stadium was big, right? Too big, arguably, right? It's cavernous, right? And why commit to season tickets when you know you can basically get a seat relatively easily because it's 50 some odd thousand seats?
That's right. Yeah. So they could come in the day of the game and buy a ticket and probably sit in a pretty good location.
All right, well, so square this with me. So I know a lot of this is all in hindsight. Now, maybe we'll have another conversation at some point to kind of go into some more granulars and some anecdotes and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting. I've been into Montreal a couple of times over the last couple of years, and it's interesting. It seems like there's almost this amnesia of nostalgia, I guess. You walk in the old town and just all over the place. You go to all kinds of stores and establishments and stuff. And there is, I don't know if it's relatively new or it's always been there, but there is very much, it's almost like the Expos, at least in the merchandise realm, is still it's almost like still there. And it's almost like and I know Montreal continues to be floated as, an opportunity for potentially a baseball team to be relocated back to there. Now, I don't know if that's the Tampa Rays Montreal sharing arrangement or what, but I guess what I'd love to sort of get a sense of, and you're closer to it than I am geographically at least. What is it in the psyche, I guess, of the current Montreal citizenry around the idea of baseball, around that of the Expos? I mean, it feels to me like there is absolutely a warm, fuzzy nostalgia for this team, despite what seems to be, if you look at it, as we've kind of done over the last 45 minutes or so, it may be, except for a couple of blips and fits and starts, I don't know if there was a true love affair of lasting quality and or of sizable scale and attendance during these years. Is it kind of wallpapering over the history, or are we is there a hagiography going on here, or what?
Good point. See, in recent years, there's been a phenomena about the fever of Expos fans and the sale of memorabilia. So here's what happened. From 2004 to 2012, Tim, there was basically no interest in reviving baseball in Montreal after they left for Washington. Eight years had gone by, and then Gary Carter died in February 2012, and that's when Warren Cromartie, who was close to Gary Carter, decided, I want to do something about reviving interest in getting a team in Montreal. So what he ended up doing was he organized a reunion of the 81 Expos in 2012, a reunion of the 94 Expos in 2014, and he was the catalyst who starting to beat the drums, and he was the catalyst who was the guy who kind of helped to arrange to have Blue Jays exhibition games played at the end of every March beginning in 2013. So I think without Cromartie, there would be none of this fever. And in the last few years, this memorabilia stuff that people want to buy, Expos hats and uniform tops and chooks and scarves, it really is quite a phenomena. And it's something that Major League Baseball in New York has noticed, all of this memorabilia craze, the fact that Stephen Bronfman and Mitch Garber and his ownership group are prepared to take on vast amount of money to bring a team to Montreal. So it's quite a different turnaround compared to the dying days of the franchise when there was basically no interest.
Now, that's really interesting. And so what do you think the prospects are for a return now? And maybe that was a question I could have asked a few months ago, but maybe now, especially given the vastly changed world we all live in now, and arguably maybe pro sports being rocked to its core among other industries. So I guess it's a weird way of asking the question. Where do you sort of see Montreal and baseball in the years to come? Is it an inevitability? Is it a distinct possibility? Is it a pipe dream? Given all that we've discussed, what do you think the possibility or the scenario of Montreal and baseball again?
I think it will happen, but it will be a few years. It's dragged out in the last couple of years. I think it's frustrating for everybody, whether it's the media or baseball fans or the ownership group of Stephen Brockman and Mitch Garber and his partners. It's really dragged out. I think Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred is fed up with the Tampa Bay situation. They're flogging a dead horse in Tampa Bay. They're flogging a dead horse in Miami. I think they want to keep Oakland because Oakland's been around for, 40 years, 50 years. But the Tampa Bay sharing experiment with Montreal is pretty weird. I don't think it will ever happen. I think before that ever happens, they said Major League Baseball will allow Stephen Brockman and his group to buy Tampa Bay outright 100% and move the team to Montreal, and Brockman's group will even try to pitch in and help buy out the lease expenses at the stadium in Tampa Bay, where Tampa Bay and the St. Pete's municipal people want to sort of buy in that franchise till 2028. And, that seems like forever away, 2028. But, expansion, I think that Montreal would be high up there on an expansion list. But, you mentioned that this latest pandemic scenario. I wouldn't be surprised if one or two teams might have to fold before 2021 because the expenses involved in not playing and paying players and employees, it may be too much.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, I've been saying this for a number of years, and again, obviously through the lens of history and our little weird, odd pursuit of teams that no longer are around and didn't make it for whatever reasons. You could make the argument prior to all this that we were sort of at, and maybe are at, still at peak sports, right? How many more teams? I mean, you mentioned the word expansion. I would have even said, even before all this crisis sort of came down, that maybe, if Montreal were to be back into the mix, into the show again, it would be a relocation, not an expansion, right? How many, we got 30 teams in Major League Soccer, right? And I'm the biggest soccer fan there is in the United States, and a huge, and I follow teams like Montreal and the New York Red Bulls and Chicago Fire and all that. But, 30 teams, I mean, like, wow. I mean, that's and $500 million for an NHL expansion franchise, which is pushing 31, 32 teams. I mean, I don't, it doesn't seem, especially now, that those levels of revenues and or local economies. And look, in the case of Montreal, we still come back to the same issue that arguably was a big part of them ultimately leaving, and that's a stadium, right? There has to be a new baseball park. I mean, Olympic Stadium's certainly not going to cut it, even if in its well-kept state now, right? You want to return to the old reasons why they left in the first place, right?
That's right. See, Major League Baseball, Rob Manfred has said that it's a requirement that Montreal get a new downtown stadium, and they do have a prospective piece of land where they would have a stadium. So that's kind of fairly set in stone where they might have the stadium. But I guess they need, of course, some go-ahead from Major League Baseball to start building the stadium. But it's so dragged out, you never know. You talk about expenses, Tim, it's very true. In this modern day and age, there's so many things that the general public can do, not just sports to go out and see, or that people just want to stay at home and watch TV. There's so many different sports that are out there in each city. It's quite a juggernaut of activities that, and a lot of money, that is required to pay all these athletes to play in a city. It's quite an endeavor to have to bring a franchise into, let's say, Montreal. It's very expensive.
All right. Well, lots more to explore, and hopefully we'll get to do this in another conversation. But a couple of quick wrap-up questions. Number one, if a team does ultimately return to Montreal, do you think the name Expos has to be part of the mix, or they would dare try another name?
I think that would be a good name. Even, I guess they wouldn't be able to use the name Royals because the Kansas City Royals have that name. But
it seems like there's a lot of value in that Expos name, right? The nostalgia alone would seem like it would be worthwhile. And look, Major League Baseball owns the rights, right, to that label?
That's right. Yeah, I think the ownership group, Brockman and Garber and all those guys, I'm sure they'd like to try to keep that name. Other names, I haven't heard too many other names, but I guess maybe if they got closer to a date when a team gets coming, that other names would come up.
All right. Well, I hate to make this the last question, but it's the ultimate curiosity, and perhaps maybe we can go deeper on this. But I cannot let a conversation, or at least our initial conversation, about the Montreal Expos of yore go without just talking about just quickly about this character known as Youppi. So in '78, there was somebody that preceded this character Youppi, and it was called Suki. Do I have that right?
That's right.
He was the first mascot, but it went like horribly wrong, right? And maybe you have a little bit of either memory or are there any anecdotes or whatever about this somewhat curious character who, ironically, now is now owned by the Montreal Canadiens. I think the only mascot that I've ever seen or heard that was sort of adopted from one sport and brought to another. Am I giving Youppi too much credit here? Was he a revered character? There you go. That's sure. The reaction I was looking for.
The overweight character, impish, cute, colorful uniform, colorful mascot who would go around and be a joy for all the fans, including the children, and he would be a nuisance for the incoming teams, the opposing teams, and in the 22-inning game in 1989 against the Dodgers, the umpire threw him out because Tommy Lasorda of the Dodgers complained about him sitting on top of the Dodgers dugout. So he's had quite a pretty good run with the Expos. And now he does this stuff with the Montreal Canadiens hockey team. But I'm sure they could work out an arrangement. Maybe if the Expos came back, that he'd work the Expos too.
And I am told by my French compatriots that Youppi is French for yippee. And apparently this Suki character, I don't know if Suki means anything in French. That was 1978. That was sort of a one-year experiment. Apparently it was the exact opposite. He wasn't sort of jovial and impish and fun. It's apparently scared a lot of kids away. At some point we'll dedicate some conversation to that because that's all part of the lore that is this franchise known as the Montreal Expos. Danny, how about a chance to promote? You have, count them, 6-8 books or so on the Expos. Maybe a little bit of hint of the writings and the specific areas of Expos history that you've done and where we can find them all and all that stuff.
That's right. So I've written 6 books on the Expos going back to 1997, and specifically I wrote about the 94 Expos with co-author Bill Young, and then I wrote by myself the book on the 81 Expos called Blue Monday, and there are several other books as well, including one that appeared in French. And the one that just came out about 6 weeks ago, Tim, is called Always Remembered, and the subtitle is New Revelations and Old Tales About Those Fabulous Expos. And it's a collection of memories from 69 to 2004. It's got 92 photographs, and I interviewed 94 people. So there's what I tried to do with this book was to come up with new revelations and new secrets unlocked that people maybe had never heard about before. And I'm getting some good feedback on Twitter and Facebook that they're reading stuff that they've never read before about the Expos. So I hit a few good points there with this book. And we can get it at the Canadian bookseller website called indigo.ca. So far, it's not on Amazon, but I hope to get it on Amazon. And people can also order copies by emailing this email address, exposbook2020@yahoo.com.
All right, a grand merci to our new pal, Danny Gallagher, and our conversation, our first one of hopefully many, into the world of the Montreal Expos. And, as Montreal and baseball seem to be a thing again, or at least in people's minds, we'll probably get into a little bit more of the stories of the original Expos. Lord knows there's plenty of them, and we just barely and proverbially scratched the surface with this conversation. But deeper learnings may be found in a bunch of Danny Gallagher's books, including his latest, literally just out, called Always Remembered, New Revelations and Old Tales About Those Fabulous Expos. As of dropping of this episode, the first week of May, you will find that at indigo.ca. That's a Canadian book website, Indigo, INDIGO.ca. I'm sure it'll be available soon on Amazon. And if you're listening to this way past May, you can check our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and see if those various links are there to Amazon. But regardless, wherever you get the book, you will enjoy it, as well as two books that we do know are on Amazon as well as on Indigo, that are a little bit more specific to a couple of different topics that we talked about earlier. One we recommend is Ecstasy to Agony, the 1994 Montreal Expos, How the Best Team in Baseball Ended Up in Washington 10 years later. That's his collaboration with Bill Young. And as also alluded to earlier, Blue Monday, the Expos, the Dodgers, and the home run that changed everything. Danny's collaboration with Larry Parrish. And again, a little depressing if you're a Montreal Expos fan, but obviously part of the lore and the story of the Expos for all its worth. And, we appreciate, of course, not only Danny being part of the show, but you listening, of course. And if you want to find out more about what we're up to, maybe you're new to the proceedings, like I said, our website is goodseatsstillavailable.com. It's all one word. And not only will you find links to these books this week, but all the media from all of our guests, if they've had them, as well as all the episodes. So you want to download them or share them or stream them, do whatever you want. They're all there, right there at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Of course, if you want to listen to our podcast each and every week, just set your podcast catcher to our little web feed. You'll find it out there wherever good podcasts are found. You'll find us. We're listed there. And, of course, on our website as well, you can find all of our social media links or just add them directly to your feeds. Of course, at Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. You'll find us at Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. And, of course, you'll find us on Facebook as well. There's a page devoted to us there. While you're on our website, you can also sign up for our weekly email newsletter. There's a little convenient link there, and we'll send you a little heads up as to what each and every week's episode is going to be a few days before the hoi polloi. And, of course, you can send us email too as well from the website or directly. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. See, it's pretty easy. What is not easy, of course, is putting this show together each and every week, as Jarry Payne, our intrepid producer, each and every week has done for 3+ years. God knows why he puts up with us, but he does, and he does a damn good job making us sound somewhat professional and decently listenable. We thank him, of course, for this week's effort, as we always do. And, of course, we thank you for listening. And, of course, please, please, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. Do all the right things that you're supposed to be doing. Don't contribute to the problem or make it worse. And recognize that we're all challenged by this situation that we're in. Nobody is accepted from any of it. And, of course, do all the right things to stay safe, and we look forward to listening. Well, no, hopefully you'll look forward to listening to us next week as we hopefully got a good show for you, and more to come, of course. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and of course, we're going to leave you with some song, a little light ditty, and of course, it's the official theme song of the Montreal Expos. Of course, well, would you expect anything else? All right, take care, everybody. We'll see you next week. Stay safe and be healthy. Bye-bye.